ישראל היא מדינת חוק. כל מי שיפר את החוק ייענש בחומרה. אנחנו לא נסבול לא הפרות סדר, לא התפרעויות.
I think that Jerusalem could show to the rest of the world that coexistence is possible. And this is, I think, the challenge for all of us, to show that Jerusalem can be shared.
Good evening and welcome to this special edition of the News Today. After weeks of escalation in Jerusalem, today the story turned to Arab villages in Israel's north, to widespread strikes and protests. In the early hours of Saturday morning, a police shooting and killing of a 22-year-old man from the Arab village of Kfar Kana occurred under contested circumstances. What is clear is that the incident has brought to the fore anger and divisions beneath the surface of Israeli society. And it comes with the city of Jerusalem already on edge, to say the least. We'll go tonight to our reporters on the ground. Tonight in El-Fachem, also in Jerusalem, Eli Ochenberg, Lea Volberg, and Sami Amudiab. And in Berlin with Jacob Elon and Julian Balul for the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And with me on set tonight to begin our discussion is Middle East analyst Avi Sakharov. Good evening.
Good evening, Norit.
And former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, Yitzhak Levanon.
Good evening,
Ambassador
Norit.
Levanon, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
We have been here in the studio for weeks talking about Jerusalem, about East Jerusalem, in particular about a deterioration. This is after a summer of discussion of Hamas in Gaza. A lot of the discussion in Jerusalem has been, is it bleeding into other areas? Is East Jerusalem going to go to the West Bank? Is that going to go to Arab villages? Now we see rioting in Arab villages and a strike. Has that happened already?
Well, I think that this evening I saw it on TV. I think it was on Channel 10. They asked the head of the Adala movement, which is an Arab, Israeli Arab from this part of Israel, and he says quite clearly there is no connection whatsoever between what happened in Jerusalem and what's going on in Cana, because the circumstances are different, and the causes are different. I think what's going on, in the Arab villages, this is something which has been going for a long period of time, of a kind of neglection. We neglected a little bit, the Israeli Authority, to deal with that issue, because they are part and parcel of the society and they have to be integrated within that society. So this is why from time to time we see such eruptions. But the basics are every single citizen in Israel has the right to demonstrate peacefully. What he doesn't have the right is to use violence or hostility or to hurt or to disrupt the public order. And this is why the authorities have to intervene within these parameters.
So Netanyahu did respond today in the cabinet meeting, saying quite clearly what he would and what would not accept. But before we get to that, Avi, do you agree that has the Israeli government in effect ignored a sort of cancer, for lack of a better word, growing inside it while dealing with Hamas, with the Palestinian Authority, with Iran for that matter?
Well, Israel for decades ignored parts of the population, meaning the Arab population, the Arab cities, and the Arab citizens in general speaking. I think that what happens today is, yes, it is very different from what's going on in East Jerusalem or in the West Bank and Gaza, but I think that the general feeling of the average Israeli citizen is that something is not stable anymore, is that the old status quo of relatively quietness is not there. We see the riots inside Israel. We see riots in East Jerusalem. We understand that the West Bank is not going to remain quiet as it was for years.
Is that a substantial belief, or is that a bit of false hope? Because Israeli culture, as you both know, is very good at saying everything will be okay and sort of continuing with daily life as it's been forced to do in very difficult situations for several years in its history. It's kind of reminiscent of October 2000, no? This feeling, okay, things are okay, and then very suddenly and very extremely, they're not.
Then again, I think that the main thing that differs from the 2000 events is lack of willingness in the leadership side, especially among the Palestinians, to start a third uprising or a new intifada. And we have to keep in mind that what happened back in 2000 and even 1987, we had the masses and the leadership. Right now, we don't see none of them, meaning we don't have the leadership of the Palestinians in the West Bank that are looking for a fight, not in Gaza Strip, because over there they ended up a war in a very tough situation. And even inside Israel, the leadership, yes, the Knesset members are trying to provoke some kind of demonstrations and maybe even violence, but at the end, The masses are not there. Yes, we see tens, maybe hundreds of people in the streets. I don't see yet the pictures of the end of September 2000.
I think the key word here, though, may be yet. I would like to continue that discussion, but before that, let's take a little more of the background. I-24 News correspondent Eli Ochenberg takes us through the past few days.
Israeli Arabs declared a general strike Sunday as protests against Israeli policeman behavior in a shooting incident were held in several universities. During the weekend, riots broke out in the Arab Galilee village of Kfar Kana in northern Israel after Israeli security forces shot dead Khair al-Din al-Hamdan during an attempted arrest operation on Friday night. Security footage of the incident shows the 22-year-old man approaching a squad car and repeatedly, forcefully hitting the window with a knife. The footage later shows the door opening and Hamdan backing off, but being shot by a police officer. Hamdan died in the hospital several hours after the shooting. Israeli police are now investigating the case, stating that while officers' lives were in danger, they did not follow protocol after the shooting. The policemen are now under guard for fear they will become a target for revenge. Furthermore, for the first time since Operation Protective Edge, Israeli security forces and police raised the alert throughout the country. In response to the incident, the political clamor rose.
Israel is a nation of law. Whoever violates the law will be punished severely. We will not tolerate disturbances and riots. We will take determined action against those who throw stones, firebombs, and fireworks, and block roads, and against demonstrations that call for our destruction.
What happened is nothing less than an execution. The video shows that the policeman shot in order to kill.
Abbas is threatening, inciting, and agitating terror and riots. And yes, whoever aims to demolish the state of Israel cannot be its citizen.
Public figures, ministers, parliament members should now act to reduce the tensions and not to raise them. The fact that there are people who are using these events for their own political interest is irresponsible.
The killing in Kfar Kana comes against a backdrop of soaring Israeli-Palestinian tensions in East Jerusalem, where there have been near-daily clashes in flashpoint neighborhoods. And as days pass, the idea of a third intifada is becoming more and more real.
And joining us now from another town where the tension has hit is Shai Ben-Ari in Umm-el-Fahim. Shai, good evening. You've spent the day there. What was the level of escalation you would see there today?
Right, Nuri. We were in Umm-el-Fahim earlier today, and there was some protests going on, an organized protest held by a number of political movements inside the town. If we talk about escalation, the protests that we saw did not get out of hand. We're talking about a relatively quiet political protest. Slogans were chanted, but it did not break out into violence. And perhaps the main reason for that was the police presence in the area was really not felt. There were no police to be found, in fact. And that is an issue that has been generating some debate in Israel. It ties into the general debate over sovereignty. How should the authorities handle these kinds of protests or riots when they occasionally break out? But really, it has to be said that in Umm-el-Fahim, there were no riots. We're talking about protests, and this was also the situation in other towns like Taibe, a little bit to the south, like Sechnin to the north, and even in Ra'at in the Negev. We're talking about protests. Where riots did break out, that would be in Kfar Kana. Not surprisingly, of course, considering the events over the weekend, also some minor incidents in Nazareth. But overall, despite a general protest, a general strike being announced today, you could say that the situation was overall relatively nonviolent.
Shai, more of what's planned for tomorrow, for the coming days. As we know, as you mentioned this morning, the strike was announced, seemingly well organized and across several different Arab villages in Israel's north. Any indication how long that's going to last?
The strike, in fact, is basically over. The strike is scheduled to end or has already ended this evening. Basically, economic activity, at least, will be back to normal tomorrow. As far as general protests being planned, it's a little ambiguous. There have been all sorts of different things that we've been hearing. From what we understand, consultations will be made this Tuesday to see what the new situation is and exactly what will be the reaction of the Israeli Arab community to the ongoing Israeli government policy. Obviously, there is a lot of anger, and I'm not sure we've seen the last of it. But I don't think that things exploded as they could have today. We did, of course, see some violence, but of course, it could also have been a lot worse.
Shai Ben-Ari, thanks very much for this. For now, we'll of course go back to later in this edition. But Mar Levanon, I would like to go back for a moment to what Benjamin Netanyahu said earlier today, trying to calm things down and also making very clear in his cabinet meeting that only certain things would be tolerated. Do you think he actually has any control of the situation, whether it's in East Jerusalem or Arab villages in the north?
Well, I would like to believe yes. Otherwise, if we do have a government who is not controlling the country, we are in a very dire situation. I would like to believe yes. Look, we were talking about the fact that for years the Israeli authorities have neglected, let's say, this part, with the Arab in Israel. But we have to be equitable a little bit, with both sides. We cannot exempt the leadership of the Arabs also. We have seen during the last few years provocative statements coming from people, from the leadership, coming from the Arab side. We have seen Hanan Zobi, we have seen the members of the Knesset. Look, I'm watching Al Jazeera every night. You have these members of the Knesset going there and bashing publicly Israel. Look, this has a certain impact into the Israeli side, and this is why you have a kind of a mistrust that is growing, and this is the problem. We have to stop it, and stop it immediately.
So maybe the better question is not whether Netanyahu has control over the situation in East Jerusalem or in northern villages, but rather of his own government.
Well, probably yes. We see some, fissures, and
I hear a reaction from Avi that's a little bit cynical.
Yeah, look, we have seen already. We have Amir Peres who quit, the government. Everybody is talking about, the next elections coming. Look, the situation is not stable within Israel, inside. Everybody is saying, that within the government there are problems. Everything
but
is.
But you have also two different messages. You have a minister, Yair Lapid, finance minister, saying things need to be calmed down. You have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu getting a little bit sharper in how we need to take control.
I think that everybody, and this is the majority of the members of the government, they are in favor of calming down the whole game, because nobody is interested in such kind of hostilities and violence. But at the same time, I think that this is the obligation of the Prime Minister to say to everybody, you have the right to demonstrate peacefully. Yes, go into the street, say whatever you have the right of expression, but without violence, without hostility or disrupting the public order. When you reach that stage of disrupting the public order, the authorities have to intervene. That
sounds quite reasonable, no?
Yes, it is. The problem, maybe it's a problem, maybe not, is my impression at least is that this state is in an election year, meaning what we hear from the Prime Minister, from its ministers, like Naftali Bennett just a couple of days ago, criticizing very roughly the government. I think that we're all preparing ourselves, all the politicians are preparing themselves for the next elections to come. And this is part of the approach, or part of the problem of the Israeli approach towards the problem, towards the Palestinian problem. Now, what we see on the Arab side is a matter of fact a kind of an attempt by the Islamic movement to flare fire, to start a fire, a big one. And if you follow up, just like Ambassador Lebanon mentioned, if you follow up Al Jazeera, if you follow up the Arab media outlets, you hear the slogans, the statements, the declarations that are coming out of the mouths of those Arab politicians, mainly those that are affiliated with the Islamic movement, like Sheikh Raed Salah. I couldn't believe that this is an Israeli citizen that is saying these words. Just a couple of days ago, he was saying he was taking part in a conference in the Negev, in Rahat, just one of the places that tonight there was some riots in. And over there he said that the Negev is the strategic area of the Islamic world. Meaning he was copycatting the slogan of the Israeli side, meaning that the Negev is the strategic area of the state of Israel. Now he's saying the Negev is a strategic zone of the Islamic State. This is what he's saying. You cannot really believe.
So with the words Islamic State, I'd like to ask you something else. Another thing, Benjamin Netanyahu in his cabinet meeting pointing a finger to Hamas, Islamic movements, as being behind, or at least partly behind, the escalation we're seeing now. Truth to that, or is that also Netanyahu pointing a finger at a very critical time for him?
No doubt. I hardly agree with the Prime Minister, but this time I totally agree with Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that Hamas and the Islamic movement inside Israel are part of this escalation, are part of the incitement against the state of Israel. Each and every city and town that you would go today in the Arab cities of Israel, you would see the green flags again. And in Kufr Qasim, just like 20 minutes from here. Even in Jaffa in some places, other places, you see that the Islamic movement has presence, and this presence is very negative.
It's enough, to listen to Hamas radio, for instance, or TV. It's enough, to listen to the statements coming from the leadership of the Hamas.
The question is, though, how much are they directly influencing what happens on the street?
Look, they're
in East
broadcasting
Jerusalem,
directly to the people in East Jerusalem. They're directly speaking, to the people, to the Arabs in Kfar Kana or in other places. They even took responsibility about, one of the incidents, that one of the guys did. So they are directly involved in that. They are active in that regard, and they are doing this, in a very premeditated way. I mean, in purpose they are doing this. So they are very much involved in what's going on.
Norit, what we see these days in Al-Aqsa, in Kfar Qasem, in Kfar Kana, in Rat, in all those places. Then again, the Islamic movement is behind this campaign, huge campaign, trying to provoke the Israeli government, trying to provoke the security forces, trying to start an uprising inside Israel.
I want to ask you something
just to
regional.
Say to everyone very quick, the Islamic movement, in the north, that has sent the Murabitin in Al-Aqsa. People, from North Israel to go and to protect Al-Aqsa, Al-Murabitin, Al-Murabitat, and female and male.
Every small thing that happens at the Temple Mount or the Al-Aqsa compound is reported on very heavily in the Arab media.
Yes.
Any presence of Jews.
Look, you are the Israeli authority. When you see people coming from the Islamic movement, going to, like the Murabitin, inside, El Mosque, which is, if you want it or not, it is still under the, let's say, sovereignty or authority or control or security of the Israeli government. We have to do something. I mean, the Israeli government has to protect those people.
While we're speaking of the Islamic movement, I would like to take this to the regional picture in just a moment, but we've been speaking of Kfar Kana, of everything that's been happening around Israel. Let's see a little bit more of that. This morning, our correspondent, Danny Swibel, went there to Kfar Kana, the epicenter of the protests and riots. Here's his report.
At the entrance to the village, the Israeli police blocked passage inside due to security concerns. Inside the town, residents mourn for the loss of the youth in their village, trying to grasp why an act seen as arrest-worthy would lead to his death.
It was a barbaric act, something inhuman. What happened with my son this Friday was an execution.
The video footage released by CCTV shows Khir al-Hamdan approaching the police vehicle, apparently trying to attack the officers with a knife. The officers emerged from the vehicle and shot Hamdan close range as he was backing away and dragged him into the car. He succumbed to his wounds a few hours later in the hospital. The story released by the officers that they had little choice but to act as they did not closely match the version caught on camera.
The Yassam unit we know well. They are criminals. They leech on you, do whatever they want. They have been here for 3 years and abused their power.
This is the camera. It's a problem for the police. They can't keep continuing to lie.
The Israeli people are good people, well educated, but the problem is the police. They are like outlaws, and this is our biggest problem.
At the heart of the controversy is a special unit of police that, according to members of the village, has brought on a range of problems in their police work. A general strike in the Arab sector was called for 24 hours to protest their behavior. The mayor is attempting to quell the tensions there, while simultaneously calling for justice.
This is not something usual. It's extremely grave. The police are supposed to be here to defend people, and they just killed an Israeli guy, a regular citizen here. It's a shame for Israel, all of its citizens, Jews and Arabs. It's going to be a stain on the history of Israel.
As it stands, part of the city resembles a ghost town, with all shops and businesses closed. On the other end of town, youths take to the streets to make their point heard. I'm standing in the exact spot where Khir al-Hamdan was shot and killed by police. Residents are walking by, pointing to the bloodstains still fresh on the ground. And many of them seem certain, based on the video evidence, that the punishment did not in fact fit the crime.
Now, before we get to the regional that I wanted to get to, we just saw a little more in detail of what happened on the night between Friday and Saturday. Is this a sort of isolated incident, so to speak? We've seen, certainly in the United States, for example, over the summer, that one shooting, that one event can really light a fire? Or is this a sign of a much, much greater ill?
It's a tough question. I think that the next couple of days will give us the answer. I know that there's a kind of a feeling of neglection among the Arabs in Israel. I know that there are problems and a feeling that the police is being too aggressive and too violent against Arabs inside Israel. But bottom line, let us keep that in mind, that at the end of the day, at the end of this day, I think that the routine is going back. Yes, we see riots, but I doubt if this violence will continue tomorrow or the day after. I think that the general feeling among the Arabs, even in Kfar Kana, even the family of the man that was killed yesterday, is that they want to go back to the calmness that they all knew in the days before this incident, and not going for a third uprising inside Israel.
Can this community, if it so wishes, choose to open an investigation against the police? Is that something likely to see?
I believe that there will be some kind of an investigation, that the internal investigation department inside the police will investigate and will check the facts. I don't know if they will blame the policeman or not. I mean, there are evidence that this man had intentions of killing someone. Maybe there was some kind of another way to deal with him, maybe, but this is for the police to decide upon that.
Look, Norit, I think that the majority of the Israeli Arabs, they are in favor of, to calm down the situation and to be integrated and to go for their living and to work and they have, the easy life or the good life, in Israel. There are the extremists, from both sides, but we are talking about the Arab Israelis. So those are fomenting, all these disturbances as what's going on. And I think that the Israeli Authority will have to deal with these people, with the extremists, which they have a certain color of a religion, extremism, or radical religion, etc. The second point is, I think that the majority would like to see that this situation will stop, because everybody knows that for a while, let's say a year or 2 years or probably 3 years, we have seen a latent malaise, within the Arab population. And it was really enough to ignite, the light and the disturbances. But I think that the majority of the people would like to see the whole thing calming down. And if the Israeli Authority will be clever enough to deal with that situation in a very a different way than coercion or force or power, I think that we come back
when
to
you
business.
mention extremism and that there may be just a few extremists, but it seems that in the greater Israeli-Palestinian conflict and within Israel, this is exactly, even a few people can cause a large uproar. When you see Moshe Feigen going up to the Temple Mount, Ariel Sharon, one small prime minister, for an understatement.
Yes, one person is enough. I can give you the list of names. Muallim and I don't know, Uri Ariel. I understand why he has, to rent an apartment in Silwan only for 2 days a week. Why? I mean,
well, to prove a point, I imagine. But
the climate is different.
But before we try to understand what his point is, I'm not sure how much there is one.
This is going back to your question: does Netanyahu really in control of his own ministers? So then again, when Uri Ariel and some of the other ministers are trying to ignite an escalation, and they know that they're going to ignite an escalation, but then again, they are dealing with internal politics. They are dealing with the elections.
Perhaps the center of internal politics is Jerusalem, internal and international politics, and Ellie Ochenberg is standing by there. She's been there all day as well. Ellie, not an entirely calm day in Jerusalem.
No, Norit, where this term is worn out by now, but as tensions spread to other areas in Israel, Jerusalem remains the center of tensions. Only a couple of hours ago, 2 buses that drove on the main highway connecting Tel Aviv to Jerusalem were stoned. There were no injuries nor damage, but police is now conducting a search after the suspect that reportedly ran into the hills nearby the main road. And only yesterday we had 2 similar incident with 11 people lightly injured, among them a 3-year-old boy when vehicles were stoned. And as mentioned earlier, police and security forces are on the highest alert, and that of course includes serious reinforcements to prevent these exact incidents.
Ellie Ochenberg in Jerusalem, thanks very much for this. We'll return to you in a little while later in this edition. I want to return to the regional issue. We've been speaking about the Islamic movement, about the presence, about the role here, and as we know in the Middle East, nothing is ever disconnected from another, certainly not in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Netanyahu has hinted that at the incitement created by the Islamic State group, is there any connection? Is the rising presence of the Islamic State group across the Middle East even a source of indirect incitement here?
Look, when you deal with incitement, usually you use the media. No, this is a statement through television or through the network, etc. And those incitement doesn't have any limit. I mean, it goes, in the air, and they were received, in different parts of the Middle East. Every incitement, every statement, if you want it or not, or every analysis or every assessment has an impact on the different people on the ground. You interpret it in a certain way, I will do it in a different way. But there is this impact, this, you absorb it in a different way, but you absorb it. So if you accumulate such kind of incitements, you start to change your mind. And this is why we see what happened. When you have the IS, speaking that we will, one day after finishing with Iraq and Syria, we will come to Al-Quds in Jerusalem. The people living in Al-Quds, they are waiting, probably one day they will come.
Speaking of Al-Quds and speaking of the Temple Mount, it's not that the situation there, and Netanyahu has been repeating this, that we want to preserve the status quo. It's not that it's changed radically. It's not that suddenly Jews are allowed to pray in the Temple Mount. Why now? Why shortly after a very intense conflict with Hamas? Why is this rising to this point now?
Then again, internal politics. I mean,
on the Palestinian side also.
On the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. I mean, after the failure of Hamas in Gaza, now they're trying to ignite an escalation or third uprising in the West Bank. Now, what's the best way, what's the best tool in order to create an escalation? Using the Temple Mount or Al-Aqsa, of course. So this is why Hamas, together with the Islamic movement, are trying to push so hard Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa. I think that we need to understand this game. I mean, meaning we cannot deal with this in Gaza Strip. In a way, it's very hard for us to ignite or start something in the West Bank because of the presence of the Palestinian Authority, the same Palestinian Authority that Netanyahu is blaming for escalating the situation. So this is why they're focusing on Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa.
Very quickly, does Abbas also have to compete with what was at least seen as a success for Hamas?
Well, partially yes, and this is why we see the declarations that are coming out of the mouth of President Abbas. But at the end of the day, this is a real competition between Hamas and Fatah, and Hamas is using Al-Aqsa in order to escalate the situation in all the other parts.
Gentlemen, I have a feeling you will be back here in not too long, hopefully under relatively calm circumstances. Yitzhak Lebanon, Avi Yisachov, thanks very much for being with me in the studio. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back after 2 minutes with more of this special edition. Stay with us.
ישראל היא מדינת חוק. כל מי שיפר את החוק ייענש בחומרה. אנחנו לא נסבול לא הפרות סדר, לא התפרעויות.
I think that Jerusalem could show to the rest of the world that coexistence is possible. And this is, I think, the challenge for all of us, to show that Jerusalem can be shared.
Welcome back to this special edition. With me now is Dimitri Diliani, a member of the Fatah Revolutionary Council. Welcome back, Mr. Diliani.
Thanks for having me.
And Mr. Dov Lippman, member of Israeli Parliament of the Yesh Atid Party. Good evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much for joining me. So I want to touch on something that we got to a little bit in the previous half hour of our program. We've spoken a lot about, is this the third intifada? Is this the next step? Without looking too much back historically. Not to the Bible, let's say, which it often gets to in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are many similarities between now and October of 2000, including especially perhaps the situation with Arab Israelis. Yeah. Is it the same thing in a new form?
Well, I think we are living an uprising in East Jerusalem at least. Occupied East Jerusalem has been suffering great deal of tension, suffocation, siege. Even when the people look at the wall surrounding the other parts of the West Bank, they don't see it as a wall that really severs the ties between East Jerusalem and its natural continuity in the rest of the West Bank. So this suffocation, Israeli discriminatory practices, violence, desecration of Muslim sites, especially Muslim sites in Al-Aqsa Mosque or Al-Haram al-Sharif, all this brings out a lot of tension. And when Muhammad Abu Khdeir was burnt alive in a brutal murder that is not, that is not on the level of humanity, does not differ from the murder of the three Israelis.
Of the 3 Israeli teens in the West Bank that preceded.
Politically, it's a whole different
story. Here, there's always something preceding everything else.
Since July 2nd, it has been going. We have everyday confrontations in Jerusalem so far. We have 7 Jerusalemites were killed. We have 1,000 injuries. We have 900 arrests. Out of the 900, 420 were presented to Israeli courts. This creates tension. And on top of that, the Israeli government, not issuing an investigative committee to the brutal murder in Kufr Kanna adds to it. We are at a point that the Israeli people, we have to refer to the Israeli people to decide, because Netanyahu and the nut jobs like Bennett, Lieberman, the Israeli people have to see them for who they are really and where they're dragging the state of Israel to.
Coming from Israeli parliament.
Sure.
From the Yesh Atid party, albeit not Benjamin Netanyahu's party. Do you agree?
I disagree, and I actually want to take issue with some of the things that were just said. Let's make some order here. There is a full investigation going on right now as we speak regarding what happened the other night, and I'll be the first to say, if it is concluded that the policemen acted improperly, they should be disciplined and they should be punished. The way some of the ministers in the government spoke, I feel, was bombastic. It was the wrong way to approach it. There's an investigation. Let's see exactly what happened. But I want to hear the Arab leaders, the Palestinian leaders, who are so quick to jump on this particular issue and call it a murder and denounce it and reject it the way they have, do the same when a driver takes a car and kills innocent civilians, Jews and non-Jews, by the way, when there's an assassination attempt against Yehuda Glick. I want to hear that same level of condemnation. And one last point. Arab Israelis en masse, I believe, want to live peacefully in a state of Israel. I believe there is tremendous incitement that's going on right now, including incitement that we just heard right now. Desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque because Jews want to go there. I, by the way, don't go there. But to use that terminology, desecration, the term that's used when people deface property or destroy someplace because people want to go there, I think it's time for the Arab side and the Palestinian side, including our guest over here, to reduce the tensions. I'm willing to do that on the Israeli side. Are you willing to do that on the Palestinian side?
In terms of the Temple Mount, I will absolutely let you respond.
That.
But one question, in terms of the Temple Mount, does he have a point, and this is a segue for you to respond, don't worry, that if this has been the status quo of the Temple Mount for a while, Netanyahu has reiterated, we are not changing the status quo. Why now in terms of the uproar over the Temple Mount?
Now, we have to know, why do I say desecration? Because the owners of the place, in my eyes, consider it a desecration. Why do they do that? Because Israeli settlers, when they come in, they drink alcohol. We
have to be able to have a conversation on facts and not based on speculation from some extremists.
I've seen it. No,
this is absurd. And the Palestinians who play soccer up there and dump their garbage there. Let's be fair here.
Let's be fair. Play soccer, yes, and that is allowed. Look, you cannot put rules for people. They make their own rules and their holy site. They say yes for soccer, no for alcohol. You have to respect that.
I wish the Palestinian leadership could take my approach of facts and let's talk on a level of facts and not on speculation and incitement.
There is no speculation at all.
The claim right now is that we desecrate the site because settlers go to drink alcohol in the Temple Mount. This is the first time I, as a member of parliament, even heard such a suggestion.
You gotta let me finish this, okay? They don't go to drink alcohol as in terms of hanging out and listening to music. As part of rituals, and I've seen it in my own eyes. What rituals? I don't know. I don't know much. I don't know as much as you do.
They can't even utter a Hebrew sentence up there, and they don't.
Look, whatever they do is felt by the owners of the place as desecration, therefore it is. If you go to the States, I mean, you were born in the States, and you claim that you are black on your form, you say, I'm African American, nobody has the right to dispute that, because that's what you consider yourself. Nobody has...
And no one can tell an African American not to pray somewhere, and no one should tell a Jew that they can't pray somewhere. Let's be fair, and let's reduce the incitement.
Can I ask you one question? The Western Wall, which is in Arabic called Ha'at al-Buraq, has been historically part of Al-Haram al-Sharif. Would you allow Muslims to pray there?
I personally would have zero problem if I was standing at the Western Wall and a Muslim stood next to me and prayed. I've had Christians do that. I would have no problem.
I'm happy.
Let's bring the level to that point where we can do that.
Let's pause for a moment. Gentlemen, let's pause for a moment and go back to the word extremists. Because it is very clear in all of these conversations, there's always reference to the extremism. On the Jewish Israeli settler side, there is absolutely extremism. On the Palestinian side, there is extremism. If both sides continue to speak to each other in terms of their own extremists, that is not to speak to the more moderate parts of their society, but rather to say, these 4 people, these 20 people do X, Y, Z, how will this ever get anywhere?
Look, I always say this, that both sides have their extremists, but the only difference is that the Israeli extremists are in power and ours are being managed. If somebody tells me that people like Bennett, Netanyahu, Lieberman are not extremists, then I don't know what mainstream means anymore. But the thing is that what I truly believe inside, that the Israeli people, just the average Joe on the street, wants peace, wants to divide the land, wants to have nice neighborly relations. This is what the average Palestinian would want. Now, the thing is that this rhetoric going on, this whole employing religion for politics, employing 4,000 and 5,000-year-old texts to determine tomorrow's politics.
You don't think, though, that the Palestinians as well invoke religion as a basis for any claims?
No, we have... Well, Fatah is a secular party, just like Yesh Atid. We are
but again, Yesh Atid is not the entire Israeli government, and you are speaking to a greater
What amazes
government.
me is that there's somehow a problem with us invoking texts that are very dear to us and claims to places that are very dear to us. That's rejected, but yet we're supposed to listen to the other side. Let's both hear each other's claims and work something out. But let's remember something else. Let's remember something else. You referenced before the brutal murder of an Arab boy during the summer. Everyone within the Israeli government, everyone spoke out against it. Everyone condemned it. The people should be brought to justice for it. Do we hear the same thing from the Palestinians? We do? Really? Yeah. When Jews are murdered in cold blood, do we? Or did President Abbas send a letter of condolence to the family of the terrorist who shot Yehuda Glick? Answer yes or no. Did he send that letter?
Yes, he did.
But how can you claim to be on the same level of us in terms of being even-handed?
No. If we want to go there, I'll tell you.
I do want to go there, yes.
Okay, then we will do that. When the 3 Israeli settler boys sit waiting for a car.
Settler boys, you have to throw that in there, right?
I didn't cut you off, but you were saying things that I disagree with. So
settler boys.
Yeah, these settler boys.
As if they did something wrong by going to school, they went. You had to throw that in there. I acknowledge a innocent Arab boy.
Let me finish for a moment.
This is not
they also weren't settlers. They were studying in a yeshiva, I believe, for accuracy.
These boys, 3 settler boys, were in the West Bank under Israeli control.
They weren't settlers,
security.
but they were in the West Bank.
They were in
They were there physically.
I'm not making excuses. When they were kidnapped, Mahmoud Abbas condemned the attack, the kidnapping, promised to help out, gave orders on TV, and you know how unpopular that is.
100%, and we praised him for it.
Okay, and he did that. And when they were found murdered, he contacted Hamas and he talked to their leaders, and they denied anything at the beginning. And when they admitted to it, we had a huge political problem, internal problem. So we don't only talk and pay lip service, we're willing to pay politically for what we consider wrong. Now, let me tell you about the letter that he sent to Shalodi family. That incident, that particular incident, not the Shalodi, the guy that had an attempt on Glick's life. That guy was murdered by Israeli police. That guy was struck in the back. So in any way you send the condolences, he was no threat. You should, as a person that you consider yourself at a high moral stand,
yes,
I expect you to form a committee to investigate how all these guys get killed on the spot after there's no threat from them. You're not willing to do that because simply they're not Jews. If they were, you would.
That's a horrible thing to say. Let's remember that this past Friday, this past Friday, I spent the entire day in Beit Jana paying respects to a non-Jew who died in the terrorist attack in Jerusalem. To suggest that I would not honor a non-Jew, you said Jew and not Jew. Let's be very clear. I will give honor to every single non-Jew. Let's live together in peace. But you should speak out right here and condemn the letter of condolences. And until you do that, there is no even-handed moral ground.
Gentlemen. On that note.
No, the fact that you cannot understand that if this man was, they were able to catch him and they were able to try him, and then you find
and he
people
shot at the police.
He was shot in the back, and you find people.
Let's go in a different direction.
And whose story is that? Whose story is that? You police. I have a different story. You have to understand that your information comes from different sources. My information comes from the people that lived it.
Let's zoom out.
That's very convenient.
Gentlemen, let's zoom out for a moment. These situations, unfortunately, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are infinite such cases as what we're discussing now. Infinite. We could be here all night discussing them and not even begin to agree. Let's look a bit at each side, because it's very easy, and something that the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government are perhaps very good at doing is blaming each other. Netanyahu is certainly good at pointing blame somewhere else. But of course, it's very easy to issue blame, and it's much more difficult to look internally at your own problems. First of all, on the Israeli side, what is the Israeli government doing wrong? What does the Israeli government need to fix to get out of this mess?
Let's remember that I'm a member of a party that believes in 2 states for 2 people. I'm a person personally who wants to see the Palestinians have their own self-determination and the ability to create a state. I believe that the biggest issue here is trust. I believe there's mistrust on both sides. There's mistrust from the Israeli side towards the Palestinians. Are they really interested in resolving the conflict? And there's mistrust from the Palestinians towards the Israelis. Are we truly interested? I believe that if we were really serious, we should be moving forward with trust-building measures that can be done. We need to be in constant negotiations.
Including settlements?
Including certainly not building new settlements outside the major blocks. I think that areas that doesn't help towards developing trust amongst the Palestinians. I would call on the Palestinian side at the same time to break its partnership with Hamas. The Palestinians, the Fatah movement, very courageously rejected terrorism, understands that there is a Israeli state in existence, as opposed to Hamas, which continues to have in their charter the destruction of the state of Israel. So both sides have what to do, but I hope that my counterpart here can acknowledge that on his side as well, that partnership makes it very difficult for the Israeli side to move forward towards an agreement.
What is the status? I'm curious, because before Operation Protective Edge, before the summer's war between Israel and Hamas, there was a lot of talk of the budding unity government between Fatah and Hamas. The war kind of put it on hold, though, of course, what's behind the scenes, we don't know. And in the last week, just in the last few days, we've seen a lot of very tense incidents between the two. What is the status?
Well, this is the thing. It's not a unity government. It's a reconciliation government. None of its members are Hamas members or affiliated with Hamas. We want to work with this government as independent technocrat government with the approval of Fatah, Hamas, and the rest of the factions. It's not only 2 factions, in order to cross to a point where we can hold elections. Because we believe that the Palestinian people will have the final say. You want it Fatah way or you want it Hamas way. And we have to give people that kind of right. Now, when we are talking about working on both sides, this is one thing that I really cannot understand why many Israelis, many enlightened Israelis cannot see that we cannot be equal. We are people under occupation. If you think that we are equal, we have the same privileges as you, then maybe you'll get the whole scene wrong. We are people living under occupation. We don't have the freedoms that you have. We are subject to much stronger...
And we want to give you those freedoms.
No,
so let's do that.
You don't. No, you as a person, you might, and I understand that.
A majority of Israelis believe in it.
But the government, but who gets elected to the government? Lieberman's, Bennett's, and Netanyahu's. These are the ones calling the shots.
Before we go back into the Israeli side.
I just want one thing.
Convenient to push it to us.
No, it's not. Look, I'm not.
I acknowledge things that we have to change. I acknowledge that. Can you acknowledge that there are things on your side that have to change?
We have a lot of work to do.
So state them publicly.
I know. I know we have a lot of things to do in terms of attitude, how to resolve this. As long as there are people voting for parties or factions that do not recognize that there is a state called the State of Israel right next to us and we have to make peace with that state in order for us to have a good life, then there is something wrong with the awareness, with political awareness, with moral issues. There are a lot of things. So I deal with them. But the thing is that to put us both as equally responsible, you cannot put the victim and whoever's committing the crime, and please don't tell me that military occupation is not a crime.
If you want to go
back... Is it a crime or not? Would you answer me?
There is no crime being committed right now at all. If you go back through history, I don't want to do that. There's
if occupation is not wrong, why do you want to withdraw?
If you want to go back throughout all of history and see all the stages, but that's in order to claim a crime.
Again, gentlemen, again we're on an endless narrative because the victim can be claimed on both sides extensively. There's a third entity.
Crime that's been committed.
If you want to talk again, it can be a lot of both. Including the occupation, there can be a lot of both sides. Okay. There is a third entity. Yes. There is a third entity, which is Gaza. Let's join that to the conversation. Well, there's a third player in the global picture of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I would say. Dr. Hani Bassous, a doctor of political science at the Islamic University of Gaza, joins us now from the Gaza Strip. Dr. Bassous, good evening.
Good evening.
So perhaps you've heard a bit of our conversation here. How, first of all, can you describe a bit, how do Gaza residents view what is happening now in East Jerusalem, for example?
Well, first of all, Gaza is part of the Palestinian land, and it's not something isolated. People of the Gaza Strip believe all the time they have been really isolated by the Palestinian Authority and by the outside world. But at the same time, they are so connected in terms of soul and belief, connected to the Palestinians in Jerusalem and in the West Bank and other places. And this is why we have seen in Gaza protests and demonstrations and statements made by all Palestinian factions. People went out in the street calling for an end for the occupation and calling for restoration of life for people in Jerusalem, especially when you talk about Al-Aqsa Mosque. People all in the Gaza Strip believe and focusing so much about the importance of this mosque and the city of Jerusalem. They do not feel that they are really isolated as people or believing this piece of land is something separate from the whole of Palestine. Despite the fact that life is being difficult for all people in Gaza, and it's indescribable. You cannot believe the standard of living in the Gaza Strip and the fear and the threat of an attack which could be coming soon in the next future from the Israeli side, or maybe the clashes within the Palestinian society in the Gaza Strip because of the tension between Fatah and Hamas and because of the severe living conditions in the Gaza Strip. But it's because of this situation, as I said again, like we have seen last Friday in Gaza here, many people out in the street in the Gaza city, in the northern of Gaza Strip and in Khan Yunis area, they were protesting against what was happening in Jerusalem, and they calling for opening the Al-Aqsa Mosque for all people to pray and have a freedom of movement. Especially in Gaza, people like we all in the Gaza Strip, less than 2 million, we cannot reach to Al-Aqsa Mosque. We are not able to move out of the Gaza Strip. And as I said, like Gaza has been, as you mentioned, it's not an entity, but it's kind of small enclave. It's been isolated from all locations, from all borders.
Dr. Bassous, how further do Gaza residents view Abbas and his government?
Well, Abbas, for people in Gaza Strip, he is the president of the Palestinian Authority, of course, but he's not the one has been doing his best to protect people in Gaza to help. As the head of the Palestinian Authority, people believe he's supposed to touch, and he's supposed to help people in the Gaza Strip to live a decent life, but he's not doing even the least he can do to help, especially after the summer war in which thousands and tens of thousands of families have been out of the street, evacuated their homes. And still up to now, I think the Palestinian Authority led by Mr. Mahmoud Abbas is not doing as much as it could. In the West Bank...
So is there a degree of disappointment?
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Bassous. I'm asking, is there a degree of disappointment?
It is. Well, people are so disappointed in the Gaza about the attitude and about the activities of the Palestinian Authority. They feel they have been left behind by their president, by the Palestinian Authority, and disappointed so much. And I think this would do more degradation in life, and people frustrated at the situation, at politics, at the social aspect, and they are calling for social change. They're calling for political change. Palestinian political landscape as it is not helping much. And when you talk about Jerusalem and you talk about the West Bank, people living completely different life. Gaza Strip, it's an open air prison.
Dr. Yes, please continue. We have just a short while.
Oh, sound is not clear. I cannot hear you well.
You know what, Dr. Bassous, we actually, the line is not too good, so thanks for now very much for this, Dr. Hani Bassous in the Gaza Strip. Some criticism towards the Palestinian Authority, a little bit of disappointment he expresses. Is that felt among Palestinians in the West Bank as well, disappointment towards the Abbas government?
Well, I wouldn't take what he said face value. As a member of faculty of Islamic University, Hamas movement hub, I would take it with a grain of salt. You know that the blame is pointed at Hamas, and the popularity of Fatah and President Mahmoud Abbas is on the rise in Gaza, especially after the last attacks on Fatah leaders in Gaza, in which Hamas is held responsible for the bombings of their property and cars and stuff like that. But anyway, this is an internal issue. But I believe that as part of the process of rebuilding Gaza, we have a lot to work for. We have to cooperate with everybody in the region in order to be able to undo the atrocities that were caused by the Israeli government.
I see you moving in your seat, Mr. Lipan.
Think about the tragedy here, the tragedy for the people of Gaza, that they're being incited to go out to the streets over a so-called desecration at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount, instead of leaders rising them up out of their streets to demand a better way of life, that the money that goes there should be used to rebuild their lives, and they should be giving a better quality of life. They're being incited about something false at the Temple Mount instead of the real issues on the ground. Real leadership would not incite them with these false claims. I even saw desecration on the screen right now, which we heard was some claim about alcohol, which is completely unsubstantiated. And instead of that, the leadership should be saying, we are here to help the Palestinian people. They deserve a good quality of life. That's what the focus should be right now, and nothing else.
I don't think that's right, because the desecration to the Al-Aqsa Mosque is not only the alcohol drinking. You go on Facebook, you'll see Quran on the ground. You see stepped on. You see rugs burned, shots fired into it. No, I'm sorry. For somebody that's trying to discredit something that not only I've seen, I've lived. I've been shot in while I was inside the mosque. So nobody tells me nobody shoots.
The claim is that we want to take it over and throw the Muslims out. Can you state right here, right now, that that's not the case? Can you say right here that there is no truth to the libel that Israelis want to throw the Muslims off?
Attitudes towards Israel. No, look, attitudes towards Israel is not going to change as long as Israel is still committing crimes against us by settlement activity.
I sat here and I said we should not do so.
By keeping us under siege, by all these border
controls. And what do the Palestinians have to do? And what do the Palestinians have to change?
Do I have to pay a price to live equally or to
I'm
live
asking,
free?
What should you change to make it work?
Look,
you're unwilling to say. I think it's very clear.
No. I said
so
what I had to say. I tell you what I have to. If the question that you're looking for, very simple, I have to resist you and your government until I get my own state.
Let me take that for a moment.
If you think that my
we'll
right...
We'll never get anywhere if you keep with that attitude. We will never get anywhere if you are a moderate leadership, and this is what you're saying. Listen to the Israeli moderate leadership. What's the Palestinian moderate leadership saying?
If you think that my right to statehood is a choice of yours, you are wrong.
Let's give quickly a response, and I want to take it somewhere else.
Absolutely. The moderate Israeli leadership is ready to make courageous, very difficult, painful choices. The shame, as we've heard right here, is that the libel and the incitement from even the moderate Palestinian leadership continues. Real change will happen the moment the moderate leadership on both sides are willing to acknowledge their flaws and willing to look forward and move forward. And I've sat here right now and I walk away somewhat pessimistic. If this is the moderate Palestinian voice, incitement, claims of things that are simply untrue on the Israeli side, we will never get anywhere. My hope and prayer is that that changes, that we on the Israeli moderate side take over the leadership, yes, but that we hear a strong, courageous Palestinian moderate leadership, not going with the extremism, not going with the incitement, leading the people to a better life. And if that happens on both sides, we'll be able to move forward and live side by side, the same way we're able to do with the moderate Israeli Arabs, with the Druze, and everyone else that I mentioned before.
For a moment, I want to take the word of resistance as an example. We started by speaking about October 2000, if there's any similarities between now and the Second Intifada. Hasn't history proven in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we could arguably globally, that an uprising like this, like the Intifada, did not prove positive results for the Palestinians?
There's difference. We had two experiences, the first Intifada and the second Intifada. The first one was peaceful, popular movement, and it proved to be successful. It brought Israel to recognize us as people to begin with and sign the Oslo Accords. The second one was violent and it was wrong. And we learned from that. And from July 2nd until today, we're going the peaceful way. So we learned our lesson and we're moving forward. But I have to say one thing regarding Israel needs to hold itself responsible. We can't have a Knesset member sitting and trying to say, let's do this together. You cannot put me in a headlock and squeeze and then force me to say I love you, and when I do, then you say it's not enough.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I think if there's a bottom line to be taken from this, it's that self-reflection does have value for everyone, individuals, and on both sides and both governments. Mr. Dov Lippman, Dimitri Diliani, thanks very much for being with me. That's it for us for now. 2-minute break, and then we'll be back with more of the special edition. Don't go anywhere.
ישראל היא מדינת חוק. כל מי שיפר את החוק ייענש בחומרה. אנחנו לא נסבול לא הפרות סדר, לא התפרעויות.
I think that Jerusalem could show to the rest of the world that coexistence is possible. And this is, I think, the challenge for all of us, to show that Jerusalem can be shared.
Welcome back to this special edition of the News Today. Joining me now on set is Dr. Alon Liel, former Director General of the Foreign Ministry of Israel. Good evening. Thanks very much for being with us. And Sami Abu Shahada, Secretary General of the Balad Party in Tel Aviv, Jaffa. Good evening. Thanks very much for being with us. I'd like to start with you we've been focusing for weeks about Jerusalem, about East Jerusalem, rising escalation. Now the Arab-Israeli villages kind of join the fray after this shooting between Friday and Saturday morning. A shooting like this, maybe if it was isolated, wouldn't spark unrest of these proportions. It to me indicates that there was something much greater beneath the surface. Is that true? What is beneath the surface for the Arab-Israeli community?
I'm not sure that such an accident of police killing another Arab citizen wouldn't have brought all this escalation or it, because we are talking about the 48 citizens since October 2000. The Israeli police has killed in the last 14 years 48 Israeli Arab citizens in different accidents, sometimes for car accidents and in different occasions. Okay, and it's totally obvious that the Israeli police is continuing to deal with the Arab Israeli citizens as enemies and not as citizens. And the people had enough, had much more than enough. The last video that we saw, this policeman killing this young man for no reasonable reason. Okay, everybody could see that the boy was quite far from the police when they killed him, and they could have arrested him in a much better way, okay, without killing him. And then after killing him, the way they dealt with his body and not bringing him an ambulance was really very complicated situation. People could not deal anymore with this. So probably things could have escalated without all this.
Alon, from your perspective, from a sort of past diplomatic perspective, looking at Israel let's say over the last 10 years, since since 2000, the year 2000 and the Second Intifada, when there was a wave of uprising between Arab Israelis and the police. Is Israel completely in the wrong here? Have they failed over more than a decade to deal with a population that is completely part of it, a population of citizens?
I don't think we can separate between what we call Arab Israelis, they call themselves Palestinians living in Israel sometimes, and the Palestinians themselves. I don't think we can totally separate between the situation in East Jerusalem and the situation in the Galilee. I think things are very much tied together. So I don't think the question can relate only to the Israeli citizens or to the East Jerusalemites or the West Bank. I see it as one package, and we see that the situation in East Jerusalem has really deteriorated. I live in the Jerusalem area. It's impossible practically for Jewish people to enter the eastern neighborhoods now of Jerusalem. And I think what happened in Kfar Kana is affected by it. And the pictures that were terrible added to it, and things are exploding now on both in the Galilee and in East Jerusalem together.
Do you agree that from the Arab-Israeli perspective, is it an isolated issue with the Israeli government, with integration into society, with discrimination and so forth, or is it also very connected to the situation in East Jerusalem?
The Palestinian minority inside Israel, most of its leadership and its intellectuals, sees itself as part of the whole Palestinian people. So anything that happens to the Palestinian people or happens to our nation in the Arab world do affect the Arab Palestinian minority inside Israel. This is in general, okay, not just with the last incidents happening in Kfar Kana and other places. Of course, we are part of the Palestinian people, and what happens to the Palestinian people affects all what's happening inside Israel also. Now, the serious problem here was the invention of what Israel called the Arabs of Israel. This was a very bad Zionist invention that got nothing to do with the history, culture, and tradition of the people living here. We were the same people before 1940. My grandfather, who is living till now in Jaffa, was considered Palestinian. Trying to reinvent him
Jews,
as something...
back in the day?
No.
Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs.
Yeah, of course. Maybe inside Palestine, yeah. But when I'm talking about the Palestinian identity, here I deal with a lot of the components of the identity. We talk about language, culture, and a lot of other things. Now, the same people are sharing the same traditions, identity, culture, views inside the West Bank, in Gaza, the Palestinian refugees abroad. So there is something that brings us much more together than what is trying to separate us. And the Israeli green line does not mean anything to us.
Let's pause for a moment. We'll come back to this. But Jerusalem, we've been speaking of. Our correspondent, Eli Ochenberg, is in Jerusalem, where I understand the situation has escalated a bit since we last spoke. Eli, what can you tell us?
Yes, Nurit, just earlier we spoke about Jerusalem remaining the center of detention, and only in the last hour, 3 different incidents in Jerusalem. The first one is a 36-year-old man that was lightly injured after his car was stoned in the city of Jerusalem. The second incident is in the eastern Jerusalem neighborhood of Abu Tul, where residents threw rocks and stones at the Israeli forces there. And a third incident, Joe Doe at the moment threw a rock at the light rail station in eastern Jerusalem. An incident, something similar to what we've seen in the past with the railway, with the light railway terror attacks that were carried out in the last couple of weeks. So as you said, the situation is escalating a bit. It was relatively quiet in Jerusalem today, but everything is so vulnerable and so sensitive at the moment that even the smallest incident can cause a much larger event. But as said, 3 different rocks throwing incidents in Jerusalem in the last hour.
Eli Ochenberg, thanks very much for this update. And before we go back to our discussion, let's look a little bit back to 2000. For many, the current protests and turmoil among Israeli Arabs are reminiscent of the riots that broke out then in October 2000 as the second Palestinian Intifada got underway. I-24 News reporter Ayman Siksek with the reality then and now.
The feeling of frustration among Arabs in Israel in light of the police action is not new. The year 2000 saw the infamous October riots, which took Israeli society by surprise, despite ample warnings of growing alienation among Israeli Arabs. In the wake of the Second Intifada, Arabs in Israel protested against Israel's actions in the occupied territories, resulting in numerous clashes with police. During the protests, 13 Arab citizens of Israel were killed by police, and one Israeli Jew was killed when he was hit by a stone in one of the protests. The October 2000 events generated significant changes within Israeli Arab society. Though the State of Israel launched an investigation into the events, it was widely perceived among Arabs in Israel that police officials were not held accountable for the casualties.
These are the clothes he died in. I still can't believe this happened.
In the aftermath of this growing feeling of frustration, parties such as Balad, the National Democratic Assembly led by outspoken then-Member of Parliament Azmi Bshara, grew suddenly popular among the Arab population in Israel. The emphasis Balad put on its Arab identity and the Palestinian cause seemed extremely pressing for Arab voters in the aftermath of October 2000. The events revolutionized the political awareness of Arabs in Israel. As the Palestinian issue grew more important in the internal political debate, the gap between Israeli Arabs and the State of Israel widened. The recent riots on the Temple Mount saw Palestinians clashing with police, but for Israelis, it was clear that it was only a matter of time before the rioting spread to Arab towns inside the country. Much like the reality leading up to October 2000, 14 years later, Arab Israelis are identifying with the Palestinian plight and taking to the streets. But the challenge for Arabs in Israel is different nonetheless. As citizens of Israel, their struggle is one being fought from within. It is not a fight against Israel as much as a fight for a different Israel. And following the recent turmoil, both inside Israel and on its borders, it now remains to be seen if and how the country will be changed when it emerges from a third consecutive week of clashes.
Mr. Abu Shahada, so after we see this report, looking a little bit at October 2000 and now, from your perspective and also as a member of the Balad party that was just mentioned, how has that evolved? How has the situation evolved in those last 14 years?
It's also good to remind the audience that what started the second Intifada of October 2000 was the way that Sharon invaded the Al-Aqsa Mosque again.
Going to visit the Temple Mount.
Same problem is happening nowadays, because I think the main problem now, Nurit, is a lot of the Israeli politicians are smelling elections. And they know that in the last few years, most of the Jewish community inside the Israeli society has become much more extreme to the right. So now a lot of the leaders are saying all these extreme sentences to win the audience because they are smelling elections. This is why we are seeing all this wrong and bad things that are spoken by Netanyahu and a lot of his ministers, and against also what happened in Kfar Kana, against what's happening in Jerusalem, and they are not ready to understand that this place, like all the warnings coming from all over the world, is a very sensitive place to the Palestinians, to the Arab world, and to the whole Islamic world.
Mr. Liel, do you agree that the Israeli government is sort of panning, or Benjamin Netanyahu perhaps more accurately, is sort of panning to the extremists because of elections and not dealing with the situation as it should?
I think most of it is because of the ideology of the center-right in Israel, especially the right wing. Most of the right-wing leaders today object to the idea of withdrawing from the West Bank, of establishing a Palestinian state. So it's not only tactics. Most of them believe so, and the result is that after the collapse of the talks that the Americans handled last year, there is nothing. There is nothing happening, not only that there are no talks, there are no attempts to enter the same room and talk. The frightening thing were the speeches of Netanyahu and Abu Mazen in the UN, in which they both said nothing in the pipeline, no agreement in the pipeline.
So speaking of the UN,
being stuck, it's inviting the world to intervene.
So you're going in this direction anyway with the UN. It's always been a player, but it's become a greater and greater player of late. Mahmoud Abbas just today, I believe, or yesterday, announcing that he would also go to the Security Council for limits for a timeline on a withdrawal from the West Bank. You have British Parliament, you have French Parliament, perhaps weighing a sort of debate on accepting a Palestinian, recognizing a Palestinian state. Where does Israel stand diplomatically? It doesn't look good.
Doesn't look good. I think it's not the UN that is the key at the moment. It's Europe. The United States sort of gave up.
Well, Kerry, he made a valiant effort, though.
Yeah, he made an effort. He made a really serious effort, but they gave up because of all kinds of internal considerations in the United States. They can't be effective.
Also because they lost hope from Netanyahu. They don't believe that this prime minister could lead to anywhere. I think he's kind of a handicapped prime minister from.
I think that it's deeper. There is a kind of a tie inside the United States. There is support for Israel in the right wing among the Republicans. The Democrats would like to put more pressure. They cannot do it because a lot of it is internal American considerations. Europe is more able to act at this stage. We saw what the Swedes did. We saw the British Parliament. And now it's triggering a momentum. I think the key country in Europe that at this stage, to my mind, is more important than the United States is Spain. First of all, it's going to the Spanish Parliament for a vote. But the more important thing is Spain was elected now for the next 2 years for the Security Council. Spain is the number 9 country. If they get Spain, they have an unbelievable momentum in Europe that can spill over to the UN and leave the Americans with a dilemma if to apply a veto or not. I think
Do you think
Spain
the
has
Security Council
become...
veto is at risk, the American veto, that Israel has witnessed many times?
No, it depends on the wording of the resolution. If the wording of the resolution is relatively moderate, first of all, you need the 9. Without the 9, you cannot submit things to vote, and they don't have the 9. Only if Spain will join the 8, then they have the 9, as I see it at the moment. But if there will be 9 countries signing for a Palestinian resolution of any kind, then it comes back to Washington. Then Obama can come to Netanyahu and say, now please behave, I can abstain, and then you get a UN resolution if it has a deadline
to
of
force
2 or 3
Israel
years.
even more into a corner, which is ultimately the goal of these votes.
Yeah.
Do you agree that going to the United Nations is the path forward, at least to force Israel into a corner, into negotiations?
I think what's happening in the international arena is the best way in order not to deteriorate into a really crazy wave of violence. And this needs a lot of international pressure on Israel. But I don't think that with Netanyahu's government there's a chance to do anything, because most of the ministers here are from the extreme right, and they are totally supported by big lobbies of the settlers and so on in the Israeli society. So I don't think that now with Netanyahu's government there's a chance to get anywhere. What is making this thing more complicated, that unfortunately inside the Israeli arena, political arena, we don't have a political alternative. In the last 10 years there is something new in the Israeli politics. Till the year 2000, more or less, at least you had two parties system.
And two ideologies.
Two ideologies. In the last 10 years or a little bit more, you have only the right and the extreme right as its political alternative, so it's not that promising.
So where does the responsibility of the Arab-Israeli leadership lie? Because there is, with citizenship, of course, it's a full part of the country, full option to be part of the leadership. What role does that play?
Most of the Arab parties have, since 2002, with the Arab Peace and Initiative, tried to put all their efforts to have a normal, just peace solution in the area. And we in the Balad Party, we gave something much more from the establishment of the party in 1995, that we said there's a very good solution, a historical compromise that could bring peace, not just inside the Israeli-Palestinian, but in the whole area, to make a two-state solution with one Palestinian state in a very small part of historical Palestine as a historical compromise, and to make Israel a normal democracy, just a liberal democracy like any other democratic system all over the world. Stop being a Jewish state and preferring Jews on non-Jews, and becoming the state of all its citizens, like any normal state you can think of.
Hold that thought, because I want you absolutely to hear what you have to say. But our correspondent Shai Ben-Ari is standing by in He joined us now again, and there were reactions across Israel, not only from the government, but also in media.
Yes, Nurit, we're talking about all sorts of reactions from the Arab leadership, as you mentioned in the studio. One particular reaction that we heard was from a prominent Arab member of the Israeli parliament, Ahmed Tibi, who actually spoke of the double standard that is often seen, at least in the eyes of many of Israel's Arab citizens, when it regards punishment taken out by law authorities. Specifically, he mentioned the example of Yigal Amir, who was, of course, not shot after he assassinated the former Israeli prime minister. And he compared this with the treatment of the Palestinian who was killed in Kfar Kana over the weekend, noting this double standard taken by the Israeli authorities. You can also compare it to the complaints that we often hear in regards to the policy of house demolition, which is often carried out by Israeli authorities against known Palestinian terrorists. Of course, many Palestinians complaining that the same kind of punishment is not taken out against who could be classified as an Israeli terrorist. For example, the murders of the Abu Khder boy a few months ago, or the case of Baruch Goldstein, for example. Those houses are still standing. So we're talking about a double standard that is often pointed out by Arab politicians. Regarding the situation in this area, we are currently in Wadi Ara, not far from the entrance to Fahim. We hear that we're receiving reports that there are now some riots going on in the town of Taiba, which is a bit to the south of here. Apparently, tires being burnt in the entrance to that town. Things getting a little more violent than they were earlier. We understand there was more of a peaceful protest earlier on there, and we may be making our way south. We'll try to get there and see if we can update you on that situation later on.
Great. Shai Ben-Ari, thanks very much for this update. I promised you a reaction.
Yeah, you asked earlier if this is the way to go. The question was not directly to me, but to the UN or diplomatic.
I wanted your response also.
Or the diplomatic way. And I definitely think there are two alternative ways: the diplomatic way and the military violent way. And I think the diplomatic way is the way to go. Not, first of all, because it doesn't kill people.
But does the diplomatic way mean a peace process or going through the UN or in European Parliament?
Look, preferably peace negotiations, but it is not on the agenda. So it has to go in a one-sided way. And I prefer it to any type of violence, if it's rockets on Tel Aviv or if it's violent demonstrations in East Jerusalem or in the Galilee. And I think our government treats both ways the same. I heard the term this week that Abu Mazen is launching a diplomatic war. The government is seeing diplomacy as a type of violence, aggressive diplomacy. So
You've been in the foreign ministry for a long time. Is diplomacy not war in many ways?
No, it's not.
Not that it's good to call it this in public, but realistically speaking.
War comes in after diplomacy has failed. As long as there is an opening for diplomacy, let's go, or the Palestinians on diplomacy. We should be part of it, I think. And I think they have a much better chance to go with diplomacy, because on the military field they will be badly beaten. The gap in the power between Israel and the Palestinians is enormous. Any way they meet us, any place they meet us, from the air, from the sea, on the ground, they will be beaten. But in Europe and in the UN, they have a fair chance. And we have to see this way, probably the more reasonable way for them to go as legitimate.
Do you think that if it does snowball, if we do see more and more European countries, and Spain included, as you mentioned, voting in this direction, that it will force, that this Israeli government will respond to it?
Sure. I'm not saying that
Not in a condemnation.
Yeah, no, I'm not
positively.
saying that this type of spillover from Sweden to Britain and maybe now Spain and others will determine what will happen on the ground. I'm not saying it. Israel is in full control regarding what's happening in the ground. But such a European consensus will move to Washington and will move to New York, to the UN. And in the UN, with the European consensus, with the three key members of the Security Council, Britain, France, and Spain, supporting a Palestinian initiative, we will have to change our policy. If, for instance, it rolls into a situation that Palestine, that was already considered a state in 2012, will be considered in 2015 a member state, then we are a conqueror of a member state of the UN. This is unthinkable. The Israeli government will have to relate to it, will have to change its policy. And I think this is the more reasonable, the more elegant, and definitely the less costly from the point of view of lives, the way they should choose.
Do you agree? I've heard you rumbling in your seat.
I totally agree with the analysis, but the problem here is that with the Israeli politicians and prime minister and ministers, that it's not the discourse of logic that is leading this government. What is leading this government is an extreme right racist ideology, and I think this ideology is making most of them quite blind. And what's happening in Israel is deteriorating very fast towards fascism in the last few years. And nobody is able to stop this deterioration, unfortunately. I mean, this is not something that anybody will be like to welcome happening here, because this will bring a lot of violence and a lot of bad things that nobody wants to see. But nowadays, if you look on what kind of a foreign minister we have in Israel and what kind of other kind of ministers, and not just Lieberman, all of his companions in the Netanyahu government are very extreme people that are having quite extreme ideology and political views. And these people are leading the Israeli state and society. And we are not seeing a political alternative which is relevant in the next few years, not just in the next elections, unfortunately, but in the next few years we're not, because we are seeing most of the society is voting for these people. These people don't come alone to govern. People are voting for them. So I'm not seeing this discourse of logic leading the Israeli government. Unfortunately, I'm seeing something totally different happening.
Looking at the current picture, taking it back for a moment to East Jerusalem, to these Arab Israeli towns on strike, or perhaps just finishing the strike now. Looking at the Palestinian leadership, what Netanyahu has blamed Mahmoud Abbas, of course, quite frequently over the last few weeks for incitement. What remains to be done there in Mahmoud Abbas's government in order to go any further?
I think that Abbas is, from his own point of view and his own policies, Abbas is leading very good in the last few years, and he is counting much more on the international pressure. He's seeing that there is no chance from inside the Israeli society. He's not seeing a political alternative to Netanyahu. This is why he's putting most of his time, most of his energies, and most of his pressure on the international arena. I think that internationally, people are seeing that the Israeli government do not want peace. They are not a serious partner for peace. They are not trying to do, not just they are not a partner for peace, They are all the time supporting the settlers and settlement.
Not a very optimistic note to end on. I'm very sorry. It's all the time we have. We always need a little more, but...
One sentence, I agree that there is no way to change the government or the ideology, but I think even the people that are ruling Israel cannot ignore this
so not
type of
ignoring
pressure,
is a little bit
and
of the optimism.
we'll have to relate to it. We just pulled the
Mr.
ambassador
Alon
of
Liel,
Sweden.
Mr. Sami Abushkhad, I'm sorry, that's all the time we have. That's it for this special edition. Thanks for watching.